Let's continue. Chapter 10, Humiliation. Douglas Jr., don't you dare go outside and get dirty. We have to leave for the church in 15 minutes. Jody was putting the final touches on her makeup as she stood facing the mirror. I'm just going to get my sword, Mom, Dougie yelled, already heading for the backyard. Doug, can you please explain to your son he can't take a sword to the church? She yelled from their open bedroom door. Straightening his tie in the foyer's mirror, Doug absently responded to Jody's plea. Dougie, buddy, you're not going to be able to play with the sword today. We're going to your Uncle Robert's wedding, remember? You're going to be carrying a pillow with their rings on it, and that's going to be much more fun. Why don't you go see if your sisters are ready to go? Dougie stomped back into the kitchen and down the hall, yelling, Audie, Lexi, Dayla, come on. Dad said it's time to go. Dougie J, stop yelling. We're coming, Dayla screamed back, walking into the room followed by her sisters. Girls, don't you look nice, Doug said mechanically. Where's your mother? She's still in your room, Audra said. Take your brother and go get in the car. We'll be there in a minute, Doug ordered. As her girls started gathering purses and sweaters and their little brother to head for the car as they'd been told, Jody walked into the room wearing a peach V-neck, knee-length, sleeveless shift with a complimentary belt, cream pumps, and a fashionable roll-up brim hat with a matching floral band. The color of the dress offset her eyes and favored her coloring. She looked like a spring personified. She was lovely. Catching Audra as she walked to the kitchen with Dougie J in tow, Jody offhandedly asked, Audra, don't you think that sweater is going to be too hot for today? Oh, no, not really. I heard it might get cold later in the day. Audra gripped Dougie J's hand a little tighter and all but ran to the garage. Jody gave her daughter a small smirk, knowing this to be a lie, but distracted by the chaos of getting to the church on time, she didn't have time to reason Audra's choice. Ever since the night of the prom, when Travis had been 2 hours late to pick her up, embarrassing her, Audra had tiptoed around her parents, refusing to talk. This simple lie about the weather had been the most words she had said in 3 weeks. Doug interrupted Jody's thoughts as he tugged on his suit tie. Make sure your brother is buckled up. Okay, Dad, Lexi answered as she too headed for the garage through the kitchen. Doug waited until the last of his kids were in the garage before he turned to Jody. With an appraising glare, he asked her, Jody, what is on your head? Straightening the hat on her head in the hall mirror, she offhandedly answered, It's a hat. Why? I know it's a hat. His sarcasm caught her attention. I want to know what makes you think you should wear it. It's a spring wedding, and I thought it went nice with the dress. The subtle halting of her arms, adjusting the hat, gave her bravado when she answered. You look like an old lady going to church. But hats are really in this spring. Jody, hats haven't been in since the turn of the century. And even if they are, some women just can't pull them off, and I'm afraid you're one of them. The look in Jody's eyes betrayed her hurt. It costs quite a bit of money. I hate not to wear it, she stammered. Just take it back to the store next week, but you need to take it off because you've got to get going. Doug turned and headed for the car, not noticing the wounded look in his wife's eyes. And you'd better hope they take it back because it's coming out of your clothing allowance. Jody regretfully, but obediently, removed the hat. She had saved 3 months of her clothing allowance to buy her outfit for the wedding. The hat had cost a third of it. Doug had always estimated what he felt she needed for clothes and controlled her monthly budget with a firm hand. When she had found the hat, she had had to forego a new pair of shoes because she was too afraid to ask Doug for more money. Whenever she had asked him for additional money in the past, he would lecture her for days on her frivolousness. Once he'd even chastised her in a department store for squandering his income. She'd been mortified when the reprimand had gotten heated enough to catch the attention of the store security guard, but Doug had convinced the man that he was simply having to put the little woman in her place. With a wink and a nod of understanding, the guard had let them pass. She had put back the $20 pair of gloves she'd wanted for winter and slid out the door behind Doug in total humiliation. Now, with a final look at the pretty little hat and giving one final touch to the soft brim, she turned and followed her husband out the door in her new peach dress, her 2-year-old pumps, and her out-of-date purse. Robert Lee was the youngest of the Warren brothers, and it was his wedding day. His wife-to-be, Darcy Otterson, was a beauty 4 years his senior, and happened to be the same age as his sister-in-law, Jody. The wedding was sophisticated and subdued in the local Lutheran church. The reception was held in the very large yard of the country club, with a tent serving as shelter for dinner and dancing. At 4 in the afternoon, with the lights already lit up to welcome in the evening activities, the day had turned out to be unusually warm for a Minnesota spring. The crisp air helped awaken the early flowers, and a warm, easy breeze soothed the heat from the sun as it slid down the individual bodies of guests. Doug and Jody roamed the landscape lawns, cheerfully greeting the guests. Since Doug had been a groomsman, he'd not had time before the wedding to talk to anyone. Feeling it was his duty as the oldest brother, he walked around with an air of privilege, shaking hands and kissing babies like a politician in the middle of a campaign. Jody, Doug, wasn't it a beautiful wedding? Bridget greeted them enthusiastically as she walked over them, holding her glass of champagne high in a toast. Bridget, I'm so glad you could make it. Doug greeted her with an embrace that was held a little too tightly and a little too long. In usual fashion, Jody ignored the display by taking a sip of champagne and turned to scan the crowd. Bridget slid smoothly from his grasp with just enough body contact to hint at flirting. It was so nice of your parents to invite our whole family. Nonsense, Doug said. Family is family. Well, I'll have to thank them all the same. Wasn't it a gorgeous wedding? Yes, it was. And don't you look stunning? Doug was barely on this side of appropriate as he looked her up and down. She was wearing a 2-piece light wool pink suit with a herringbone pattern. The skirt was a mid-calf pencil skirt that complemented her thin calves. The look was set off by a cream-colored straw pork pie hat with a black band perched above a stylish ponytail. Thank you, Bridget said jauntily, and you're not so bad yourself. The hat really complements your face, you know. I don't know why more women don't wear hats. Doug's slurred compliment was being helped along by 3 glasses of champagne and 1 large double scotch. Jody, aware of the exchange between her husband and her sister, pretended not to notice by continuing to casually nod at passing guests. Doug's last statement, however, had her looking over suddenly, hurt and confusion apparent in her eyes. I so agree, Bridget said with a wave of her hand, but a lot of women just are not up with the current trends. Looking at her sister, Bridget saw the confused look on her face. What's the matter, Jojo? Using the pet name she had always called her sister. Don't you like my hat? You know, if you had come to the mall, I could have helped you find one that matched your dress, too. Jody was too upset to answer as Doug swayed on his feet, oblivious to her stare. Noticing the exchange between husband and wife, Bridget said in her usual unabashed style, Well, we can't all outshine the bride, now can we? Bridget had a unique talent for always being able to bring the conversation back to herself, no matter the topic being discussed. It was her main mission in life to be the center of attention. Being told from a small child she was pretty, first by her parents, then her grandparents, and then verified by the many boyfriends and dates she always had, Bridget had always believed it. In her heart of hearts, she believed other women envied her and all men wanted her. She wore this trait in her personality like a warm fur, cloaked in pretension, and accepted it without the self-consciousness that might attack a more modest woman. So without the bothersome energy of expending humility, she accepted her brother-in-law's flirting as just another day of being admired. I'm sorry, yes, I like your hat. I had a hat I was going to wear, but uncharacteristically, Jody stopped slowly, yet defiantly, to explain the situation when she was interrupted from behind. Hello, everyone. Archer had stepped to Jody's side, brushing her arm lightly with his sleeve. Archer, buddy, how you doing? Doug slurred as he took a whiskey sour from the passing waiter. Good. It was a nice ceremony, wasn't it? Yes, it was. Did you get a drink or maybe 3, joked Doug. Yeah, I'm sticking to beer. I've got a game tomorrow. Turning to Jody, he said, Jody, you look very pretty today. Thank you, Archer. You look very handsome yourself. I wanted to thank you again for the dinner the other night. It was very good. He was engrossed in how the sun kissed her shoulders, making them look particularly soft and glowing. "It's my pleasure. You know you're always welcome." Bridget eyed Archer with bedroom eyes so obvious children would have had to have been censored. He was the true reason why she had come to the wedding alone. Becoming impatient for him to notice her, she started pursing her lips in a pout that rivaled Marilyn Monroe. Archer, unaware of his slight, continued to focus on Jody. "Well, I very much appreciate it nonetheless, particularly now. To tell you the truth, I needed to stay with friends." "Don't be silly, Archer. You're family, you know that." Archer showed appreciation for her comment with a slight tilt of his smile as he stood in his habitual stance with his hands in his pockets, staring at her. Jody, uncomfortable with his stare, looked down at the drink in her hand. Bridget, loudly sighing at being ignored, glided over to Archer's side. Like a hungry cat sliding between its owner's legs, she cunningly grabbed his attention by hooking her arm through the crook of his, making sure her breast brushed his forearm, and all but purred. "Archer, aren't you even going to say hello?" A slight reddening of his face betrayed his embarrassment of not noticing Jody's younger sister. He looked down with a sincere apology. "Oh, Bridget, I didn't see you standing there. I'm sorry. How are you?" Truly confused at his admission, Bridget cocked her head back like she'd never conceived of such a thing. Stammering slightly, she replied, "Fine, thank you." Whether it was a form of punishment for him ignoring her or true interest in his well-being couldn't be determined when she said, "I'm so sorry to hear about your divorce." Bringing up his divorce on a day that had already reminded him of his own failed marriage made Archer square his shoulders. Well, I guess sometimes things just don't work out like you'd hoped," he replied as he subtly tried to extract himself from her arm by standing straighter and pulling his arm close to his side. "I totally agree, but you know you'll always have friends you can come to if you need to." Bridget held onto his arm like a weed with burrs. Her innuendo was becoming embarrassingly obvious as she then grabbed his hand and held it between her breasts so tightly her cleavage sandwiched his pinky finger. Jody could feel Archer's ire rising, which seemed to be completely missed by Bridget as she continued to ramble on about friends of hers who had also divorced. Wanting to diffuse the situation before Archer lost his temper altogether, Jody interrupted Bridget. Would anyone like something to drink? The waiter is heading in the opposite direction if you do." Pulling his hand from Bridget's stronghold, Archer turned to Jody. "Jody, your drink is empty. Let me get you something." He turned from the group so quickly he practically ran in the opposite direction, forgetting to ask Bridget or Doug if they needed a drink too. Archer's quick exit and dismissal of her had Bridget refocusing her attention on her sister. Staring at Jody like she was studying a bug under a microscope, her mental analysis quietly popped from her mouth unheeded. "It's because you're blonde." Before Jody could ask Bridget what she meant by her remark, the head caterer stepped up to the front of the tent and announced dinner was being served. Within the short hour between the ceremony and being seated for dinner, Doug had had enough drinks to heighten his limited inhibitions. He was feeling every ounce of the alcohol that coursed through his bloodstream. He put his arms around the waist of Jody and Bridget and half-guided, half-stumbled his way to their reserved tables. Since he and his brother Bill were groomsmen, the tables directly in front of the head table were reserved for them and their families. Each round table held 8 guests. The bride and groom, their parents, the maid of honor, and best man. The bride and groom's best friends were also seated at the main table at the front of the large white tent. As the oldest brother, Doug purposefully took the seat closest to the head table facing the guests so that everyone could see him when he gave the toast he felt was his right to give. Doug and Jody were joined by Dougie J. and Bill's family. Audra, Lexi, and Dayla had been seated with their grandma and grandpa Olson at the next table with Aunt Bridget and their Aunt Nora's family, who had to be squeezed in with a couple of extra chairs. Drinks continued to be handed out by the bar staff on silver trays during dinner, and Doug snagged one with every passing. His face had become a blotchy redness, and his words were showing signs of a heavy tongue. Dinner was proceeding festively with talks of the dresses and flowers and songs when Nora decided to play mother to her niece, who seemed to flush from the heat. She reached her arm around Audra's shoulders and asked, "Sweetie, it is so warm. Why don't you take off that sweater? The touch of her aunt's arm at the base of her neck had Audra flinching. Her sudden movement startled Nora and caught Jody's attention. Audra, honey, what's wrong? Did I hurt you or something? Jody stared at her daughter, waiting for an answer. Her fear of what she suspected had alarm building at her feet and working its way up her body in a cold chill. Oh, no, it's nothing. I just slept wrong and have a crick in my neck, that's all. It's kind of tender. I get one all the time. I think my pillow is too old or something. I thought if I left my sweater on, the heat will help it, you know. I just need to stretch it. Her overly excessive explanation only made her lie more obvious to her mother. Jody couldn't stand her daughter's constant excuses anymore. With unaccustomed force, she was determined to get to the bottom of her daughter's strange behavior once and for all. As she proceeded to stand so she could walk the 4 feet to Audra's side, the soft tapping of a spoon on a wine glass next to her redirected her focus, and she slowly sat back down. It was Doug. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began as he stood with a slight wobble, "I'd like your attention, please." His voice was firm with an apparent slur as he concentrated on each syllable. He dragged each word out as if he were trying to overcome a lisp. The alcohol had definitely taken its toll on his senses. The audience slowly quieted down and all heads turned his way. He continued, "I'd like to congratulate the the new couple, and welcome Darcy into the family. Look at this beautiful bride. Are they not a great couple?" The crowd turned their faces to Rob and Darcy with smiles as Doug kept speaking. "Marriage is a sacred institution, he chuckled. The crowd shared his mishap with nervous laughter. He took a second to gain his composure and get control of his tongue by hiding his drunkenness with a sip from his water glass. It was a trait of Doug's to never appear out of control or vulnerable. Setting down the glass, he tugged on the vest of his tux, and like some magical force pulled himself together with the will of strength uncommon for someone with so much alcohol in his system. As everyone who knows me knows, I've been married for a long time, over 20 years in fact. Feels like 50, right, honey? He grabbed his glass to Jody with a laugh. The crowd laughed with him. Jody looked up as Doug turned toward her, unsure of what her response should be, but hearing the laughter around her, she smiled uneasily. Feeling he had the full attention of the audience, he turned back to the bride and groom with a glass of champagne in his hand. "Marriage is a challenge. It's something you have to work on daily. To me, it's like the meeting of 2 cultures coming together to form a village with children, responsibilities, traditions, and laws, homes that need to be built, farms with seeds that need to be planted, and a new unified culture that needs to be cultivated." The crowd was enthralled with his metaphors, and the more experienced couples shook their heads in agreement. Feeling especially proud of himself, he preached. Sometimes the 2 cultures that meet the equal in their experience, intelligence, and politics. These are the villages that succeed and thrive. Looking at my brother and his new wife, I believe that they have just such unification. There were ahs from the crowd and a slight applause. "I want you to know how happy I am you have found each other. Looking at your new bride, though, I can see that there will not need to be much cultivating for you, Rob. She is beautiful and intelligent. I envy you your success in your choice of a wife." Rob raised his glass in salute to his new wife. Darcy gave a slight nod of her head to Doug as a thank you. "It's something not all of us find in a wife," Doug said pointedly. Some of the crowd turned their attention to Jody, while others were simply focused on the speech and its meaning for the new couple. Jody sat with a smile plastered on her face, seeing the stares from the corner of her eyes and growing more uncomfortable with each word, not sure what direction Doug's speech was going. "When I married Jody, well, you could say it was like the Roman Empire making an alliance with Nebraska. She was very young and inexperienced. I didn't even give her a chance to finish her education, but wanting her all to myself." He smiled broadly and the crowd followed his lead. "Yes, I've had to groom her over the years since she was not blessed with her sister's brain." He looked at Nora with a raised glass and she returned the compliment with her own. And I may not have gotten the pick of the litter when it comes to looks. He turned his attention to Bridget. Bridget beamed with knowing superiority. Jody's stomach was beginning to drop, and the old feeling of dread was slowly sneaking up her backbone. She blinked rapidly a couple of times. Those looking her way gave uncomfortable chuckles and looks. To keep from having tears form in her eyes, Jody batted them and looked down coyly. This movement was misinterpreted by the crowd, thinking she was in on the toast, and it eased their momentary apprehension. Doug's speech seemed unending. But all in all, she's been a good child bearer and has helped me build my village with strong, healthy children and a solid foundation. Not knowing what else to do, Jody looked up, plastered on a fake smile on her mouth, and sat frozen in place, keeping her hands folded in her lap and her back straight. She looked up and watched Doug finish his speech, but her eyes were blinded by humiliation. So let us all raise our glass to the new couple and wish them a solid foundation while they build their own little village and sow their own seeds, so to speak. Doug laughed as he raised his glass in a toast. The crowd all lifted their glasses in salute. Just as everyone was finishing their drinks, Doug added one more stone to Jody's stomach. Oh, and Darcy, do me a favor, would you? Don't go to seed like my wife. It makes it hard to want to plow the fields, if you know what I mean. While everyone applauded and laughed, Doug stepped forward and hugged his brother and her new sister-in-law. As he walked back to his seat, the older gentleman patted him on the back. With mock understanding of the speech they were convinced was all in good fun, as their wives playfully swatted their husbands' arms. Jody sat drowning in disgrace, knowing Doug's speech was not in jest. She gave a mechanical smile to those who were congratulating her on how clever her husband was. She turned stiffly in her chair, trying to hide the pain. Not sure how to react, her eyes slowly roamed the crowd while she tried to keep them from their intermittent blinking. She found Audra staring at her with open humiliation. She looked at Lexi, who was looking down at her plate and pushing the food back and forth with her fork like it was the enemy. Dayla simply looked confused, not sure why some people were laughing, but her sister seemed angry. Jody gave her daughters a shaky smile and continued to discreetly look around the tables when her eyes fell on Archer, who looked fit to kill. She was confused by his reaction. Was he angry at her for her ineptability of being a satisfying wife to his best friend? Then, with painful trepidation, Jody's eyes fell on her mother's face. It had turned a sickly paleness, and her eyes were downcast, as if she too were ashamed to look at anyone. Slowly and reluctantly, like a child preparing herself for punishment, Jody looked at her father. He did not have the same reaction as her mother. He did not hide from the shame he felt for her. He simply looked at her with contempt in his eyes and nodded in understanding, as if to say, "I knew Doug was embarrassed of you, girl." Jody stared at her father, but really didn't see him. Her blinking had returned with renewed force, and her breathing became labored. An odd sensation came over her as she watched her father slowly fade into a dark cloud that had engulfed his head and was working itself down his body in misty calmness. The cloud mesmerized her, and she felt herself begin to float. The familiar tingling sensation in her face and hands started to elevate with her body. She knew if she just let go herself, she'd be able to float above the crowd and disappear. It seemed like such a nice thing to do. She started to let her mind go to see how far she'd fly when a strong, gentle hand cemented her in place. "Well, look who I found under our table," the colonel said as he touched Jody on the shoulder with one hand as his other hand held Dougie J's. Jody could hear her father-in-law speaking, but it seemed as if he were talking to her from another room, distant and quiet. "Mommy, I was playing submarine." Dougie J looked up at his grandfather with a smile. Dougie J, her son. Her son was talking to her, but his voice sounded muffled, like she had cotton in her ears. She looked at him and forced herself to concentrate on his words while she stared at his mouth. The colonel squeezed her shoulder and was touched with warm and comforting, seemed to ground her. Grandpa said it was okay. His little face had a look of concern on it as he watched his mother's eyes look at him as if she didn't quite recognize him. "Yes, I did. All little boys should have a submarine all their own. Jody looked up at the colonel and saw his eyes were filled with a kind of softness she didn't understand. She looked at Dougie J, confused to why his face was so close, but his voice seemed so far away. Was she already too far above the ground? She wondered. If so, how could she feel the colonel's hand on her shoulder? Her mind was swirling, trying to make sense of her surroundings. "Jody, are you all right, dear?" the colonel asked sympathetically when she hadn't responded to Dougie's excited playfulness. "What?" She looked up into the colonel's face, her eyes blinking rapidly. She felt herself slowly floating back down, her body returning to the solid foundation of her chair. "Jody, dear, don't you worry about that ridiculous speech of Doug's. We all know he has a bad sense of humor when he's been drinking. As far as I'm concerned, you are the pick of any litter." He knows. This sweet, sweet man understands, she thought as her mind became one with her body again. How she loved her father-in-law. He always made her feel beautiful and worthy. "Mommy," Dougie J let go of his grandfather's hand and threw his tiny arms around his mother's neck. "Mommy, I love you. You're the best mommy in the world." "Well, of course she is," he confirmed as he slowly looked down at his grandson. "Don't you worry, Jody, dear." The colonel turned his attention back to her. "I'll have a talk with him." He tried to soothe the wounds he'd seen in her eyes. "Oh, no, that's all right, Colonel," Jody replied as she hugged Dougie around his middle. "I'm all right. Really I am. I know he was joking," she lied. "All I need is a hug from my two favorite men." She reached over and squeezed the colonel's hand. Dougie J turned his head and kissed Jody on the cheek. The colonel watched mother and son for a moment, then nodded and walked away. Jody continued to hold her son like a lifeline that kept her tethered to earth. She looked past her tiny son's shoulder, out the opening of the tent and into the fading blue of the sky. That sky that beckoned her. She yearned for that freedom. No, she chided herself. She couldn't be tempted by the freedom the feeling offered her. Her son needed her. So she simply stared at the clouds that floated slowly past in the distance and set Dougie J in her lap with her arms around his middle. In a few seconds, the feeling of his breathing against her chest calmed her yearnings. She was fully back in the reality of the moment and things were going to be okay, she reminded herself, but still feeling she had almost made it past the ugliness to freedom. But not now. Later, she thought, when her children no longer needed her. So she would wait.